It was a smokescreen, concealing far more subtle, complex engineering work. I found a report from a commission established immediately after the city's restoration. It stated that a number of old structures no longer meet modern standards and are subject to immediate demolition. But the strangest thing is that the commission specifies the exact number of buildings that supposedly need to be torn down. The problem is that many of these buildings no longer existed after the fire, meaning the list was compiled in advance. And if such lists existed in one city, how likely is it that they didn't exist in others too? Now consider one more detail. In several cities, there is evidence that the fire spread faster than physically possible. In one case, the distance between 2 blocks was approximately a kilometer. The fires were separated by mere minutes. The official explanation is strong winds. But even with a very strong wind, flames take time to engulf densely populated areas. What if the flames erupted in several places at once? What if this was a series of targeted arsons, carried out in an organized manner, and these arsons, moreover, were aimed at specific types of buildings, the strangest, the oldest, the most inconvenient for the new version of the past? And here's the climax. Looking at these cities before and after the fires, you get the feeling that the world experienced not destruction but a reboot, as if the old era didn't end on its own, but was brought to an end by someone who decided to erase the past and start over. People as a new population, the city as a new stage, history as a new book. But if the world truly was rebooted, then who pressed the button? When I first compared the dates of several major fires, I was struck by their chronology. The fires struck different parts of the planet, from North American cities to the territories stretching between the Baltic and Black Seas, almost in waves. The intervals between them seemed calibrated, averaging 10-15 years, as if someone were conducting a large-scale operation across the regions, slowly but consistently, as if peeling away the upper layers of an undesirable past. Official history attributes this period to the underdevelopment of firefighting technologies, but this sounds odd when you see that the disasters occurred not chaotically, but with a striking rhythm. Now imagine, the cities are already replete with the architecture of a previous era, too sophisticated, too massive, too technologically advanced for the level of development historians attribute to the mid-19th century. And right next to it is a young industrial era, just gaining momentum. The old system, whether fictional or real, becomes inconvenient. It must be concealed because it doesn't fit into the new worldview framework. The cleanup begins, but here's the strange thing. Fire doesn't destroy everything. It burns precisely those areas where architectural anomalies are concentrated, those buildings that went beyond the bounds of conventional construction technology, those structures for which no one could later provide a logical explanation, either in terms of the time of their construction, the labor resources, or the materials used. In several archives, I came across descriptions of so-called unusually intense outbreaks. These are places where the flames seem to burst from within, rather than spreading from the outside. And it's important to emphasize that this is an artistic depiction, but it's based on actual eyewitness accounts of explosions, flashes, and the instant collapse of supporting columns. What does this resemble? Not a natural fire, but something more precise, controlled. As if the goal wasn't to burn the city down, but to destroy specific technologies hidden within buildings whose layout was far from simple. But where did this technology disappear to? Where are the traces of tools, diagrams, and blueprints? Why wasn't a single artifact found in the restored cities that would testify to the high technological level of the past? And here comes a detail that's difficult to ignore. In almost every city damaged by such fires, archival depots were created within a couple of years of restoration, where documents found during the cleanup were collected. But almost all of these documents, surprisingly, date back to the period after the disaster, as if the world's old paper memory had been replaced with a new one. And here arises one of the greatest paradoxes. How could such cities have emerged immediately after the fires? In a matter of years, administrative buildings, train stations, theaters, and schools sprang up, all built in a uniform style, as if the same management stood behind them. This resembles a situation in which an old system is destroyed and a new, simplified one is erected in its place, adapted to the coming industrial era. The city became a factory, the population a labor force, and history a tool, standardized like an arithmetic textbook. But there was another detail that made me look at everything from a different angle. In several cities after the fires, plots of land were discovered where traces of buildings extended as deep as entire floors, 5-7 meters below the current level. Officially, this is called the accumulation of a cultural layer or natural uplift of the ground. But these explanations strangely coincide with what happened before the fires. Many basement levels were filled in advance, as if the old floors were meant to disappear from view before the city burned. Everything comes together in a frighteningly structured sequence, clearing the underground levels, dismantling individual building elements, removing materials, then a fire that erases all traces of preparation, and finally, rapid construction according to new rules. As if someone didn't want to destroy the cities. They wanted to destroy the past these cities held. And here's the main question, growing louder. If the fire wasn't an accident, but the final touch of an operation, then what exactly were they trying to hide? What knowledge, what devices, what evidence that our civilization isn't the first and perhaps not the most advanced? And if so, then the Great Fires weren't the end, but the beginning. The beginning of a new era, created as a reassembled world, where memory is reformatted and history is rewritten. So let's imagine the final picture. The 19th century is approaching its midpoint, and the old world seems to be beginning to come apart at the seams. Monumental buildings, rooted in a deeper era, no longer fit into the new reality. The industrial era is about to dawn, but it cannot take off while the streets are lined with structures that seem to have been created by people who mastered different construction principles. Technologies of the old world, real or imagined, prevent the new era from becoming self-sufficient. And then what we today call the Great Fires begins. But here's the key point. If everything happened exactly as it appears in reconstructions, what exactly did they want to erase? What knowledge could have changed our understanding of the past? Several reports compiled after the disasters contain references to strange metal structures found beneath the rubble of buildings officially considered stone. These descriptions are extremely brief, almost fragmentary, as if the authors were afraid to say more than is permitted. They mention stiffening ribs, unknown alloys, details that defy study, and all of this disappears almost immediately. There are no photographs or samples, as if this part of memory had been meticulously purged. And even if, within the framework of a fictional scenario, we imagine that these could be fragments of technology from a previous civilization, the very strangeness of the disappearance of such finds is already cause for concern. Another important detail is the demographic surges that occurred immediately after the fires. Imagine a city that has lost a significant portion of its infrastructure and population. And then suddenly, within a few years, it is filled with new people, as if they were deliberately directed to the cleared area. In a fictional version, this looks like the process of settling a new page of history. But even if we consider everything in the context of real data, the question remains, why are migration flows poorly documented and their sources often unspecified? It feels as if the population was expected to appear, but not arrive, as if the new world was being created not only architecturally but also socially. Now imagine the philosophical level of the whole picture. If the world really did experience something like a reboot, at least in an allegorical sense, then we live on the surface of a layer beneath which lies another history, forgotten, burned out, or simply not included in the school curriculum. And then the Great Fires become not tragedies, but boundaries, lines separating the old order from the new, borders between the reality we can document and the reality we can only reconstruct. And if you think deeper, a frightening yet fascinating thought arises. Perhaps our civilization really isn't the first, but simply one that exists after a great purge. Perhaps we, a generation given a new textbook, carefully bound and purged of unnecessary chapters, our history, as if it were a giant whose memory was cut off so he could learn to walk again. But if so, then we are faced with the question of that's impossible to ignore. What will happen when memory begins to return? When more and more people ask uncomfortable questions? When archives become more accessible? When analytical technologies allow us to peer into the oldest layers of cities? What happens if we discover that we are standing on the foundation of a reality we know almost nothing about? This thought becomes the final bombshell. The Great Fires of the 19th century, in artistic reconstructions, appear as a global attempt to erase the old world and write a new one. But if our world has already been rewritten once, then why not assume that it can happen again? And who will then be the ones who decide it's time to press the reset button? Anyone who asks such questions is already going beyond the usual narrative. And if you've listened to these lines, then you are one of those who are ready to look deeper than the official version allows. Share your thoughts, subscribe, because we will continue this investigation, and perhaps, together, we will be able to understand the most important thing. Who is behind those pages of history that were burned before we had a chance to read them?